I guess before I start, I'd just like to say, I guess to the law students, but this applies to anybody. I have a free foosball table in my basement, and if you want to come to my house, I'll help you get it in, whatever you got for a vehicle, and just get it out of my yard, okay? I'm not saying that to ingratiate myself. There's a man right there, okay? Not to ingratiate myself with the audience. That would be a cheap trick. I'm going to do that, try to do that with bad jokes. Anyway, it's great to have you all here. We're talking about electrification today. And this is the electrification that we think of, or at least the electrification I thought of a couple years ago, right? Back in the 30s, the investor-owned utilities could do business down in the valley, but the people up in the hills, the people in the farmhouses down the road couldn't get electricity. So as part of rural development, the government stepped in and co-ops were created and municipals were created and electricity was put out and the public at large was able to take advantage of these things. So it's a different sort of electrification, but I think it's very important to recognize that the public interest, protecting the public interest, ensuring the public interest is today just as big a task as it was in the 30s when we got electricity for the first time out on the hill to Mrs. Jones up on her farm. And there are different words for it: environmental justice, equity, but that's at the bottom of what RAP has just done over the last year. We put out a series of 4 papers. It looks like we have a bunch of stacks of the same paper, but there are actually 4. There's a principles paper and one on space heat, water heat, and transportation. So anyway, what I'd like to do is explain a little bit about my organization and then just run through what I think are going to be themes and topics that you're going to come across today. I'm going to zip through some of these things. So if I go quickly, please don't be upset because you're going to revisit this. If I don't spend a lot of time, for instance, talking about technology, people are here to discuss that today and fill you in. So what we're going to do is just take a quick circle around the topics we're going to be discussing today. This morning is largely focused on opportunities, getting you to understand what sort of opportunities, what's the big deal, why are we talking about electrification here in the first couple decades of the 21st century. And then this afternoon we'll be talking about challenges. You have to pay for this stuff, you have to implement it, you have to develop programs. You have to look at programs you got that may be in the way. Programs that look great in 1980, but may need changing today. So that's how we're going to divide the day. I work for the Regulatory Assistance Project. We're foundation funded, former state utility regulators largely, some environmental regulators. We work on sustainability and we think of rational energy policy. We help utility regulators largely with policy and technical issues. We're in the US as well as in the EU, India, and China. And this gives you a sense of what we'll be discussing today. I want to just focus back on this idea of public interest. Energy trends, what's the big deal? Why are we talking about this now? And what makes electrification beneficial? There is electrification, but we're talking about beneficial electrification, doing it in the public interest. And then look at a few principles. Any questions before we start? Keep your cell phones on. They can beep. Feel free to talk on your phones if I'm talking. I'm not worried about it at all. I'm a big enough man to handle a cell phone, yeah. They will. We will, and Mark will be pointing that out to you when he gets up with his next panel. I should add, these folks just jumped out of their seats. Raise your hand if you have a question. We'll bring a microphone to you because this is going to be put on the web and folks need to hear your questions. Okay, so resist the urge to blurt out your question. Blurt out a raised hand instead. Okay, let's get rolling here. First, a very brief history, what I'm talking about, protecting the public interest. This idea of public interest is sort of a counterpart to private interest. People have been in business for many years, and they pursue their private interests. But the public interest is a concept that's come up. It's been around in the law for a long time. Back in medieval times, it was recognized in English law that there's a certain public interest associated with inns and places to stay. People recognize that, you know, people are traveling. England is commercial in a sense, and that if you're the only show in town, you can charge anything that you want. And so they recognize this concept way back then, that certain private industries, private businesses are affected with the public interest. Fast forward to the 19th century, Supreme Court case affecting the public interest comes up, affected with the public interest comes up again. This is a case about grain elevators. Well, what do grain elevators and medieval inns and the power sector have in common? I think arguably you'd say they're all networks, and they're important networks to making sure that the economy and that the culture works the way it should. Essentially, there was a challenge back in the 1870s by farmers who only had one way to get their grain to market. And they had to put them on that railroad network, but the companies that stood in the way were the monopoly owners of grain storage. And so the idea of rate regulating was developed and approved by the Supreme Court back then. So medieval times, 19th century. I said this is going to be a quick history lesson. Today, you go to a utility commission and you get a certificate of public convenience, or you get a certificate of public good. That's where this comes from. The idea that there's a public aspect to the sorts of things we're doing when it comes to energy systems. And it's not money talks and bullshit walks. It's everybody gets access. It's about equity, okay? Second history lesson. Here we are, 2019. I want to take you back to 1989. A friend of RAP's, a guy who's worked for us for a long time, Jim Lazar, is a utilities analyst out on the West Coast. And one of his early jobs was for natural gas companies. He was asked to analyze the economics of he didn't work for the natural gas companies. He worked for other delivered fuel companies. But the economics of adding a natural gas plant to provide more electricity out in that region because they were worried about the hydropower not being accessible during dry season. So what they thought, with all this electric heat, we have this hydro, we need something to fill in, so let's get another power plant in there. And Jim looked at this, and his analysis said, no, what you really need to do is stop heating with the resistance heat, and you have to start heating with fossil on site. Okay, I want to let that sink in a minute, right? Because that's just the opposite of what we're talking about today. And I said, Jim, that's very interesting. He said, no, this was the cheapest, the cleanest choice in 1989. I said, well, that's interesting because today the analysis is the same, right? He said, the analysis is the same. I said, well, what's different? He said, all the inputs. And the conclusion, entirely different from what it was in 1989. Well, what do we mean? Well, renewables like wind and solar weren't really economical, right? Heat pumps had these coefficients around 2. Heat pump water heaters, not really out there. People were talking about them. Natural gas conversion efficiency. Natural gas will be used to balance renewables, right? 40% thereabouts, okay? When you come fast forward today, you've got wind and solar at 2 and 3 cents a kilowatt hour. Very, very cheap, okay? All over the place, not just in certain places. Modern heat pumps with coefficients of performance above 3. Cold climate heat pumps performing really well. Heat pump water heaters available. Gas generation, more like 60% efficient. When the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining, that's there. And you have all sorts of modern technologies, bright, shiny things that I'll touch on a little bit here, that make managing a grid digital, automatic, and very fluid and flexible, the capabilities that weren't there. We obviously have a challenge here when you look at the opportunity space heating, water heating. What we're looking at is natural gas and propane being a big part of that. People listened to folks doing the analysis that Jim was doing back in 1989. And to the degree that those things can be electrified, you can avoid a significant amount of CO2, obviously. The cost of wind has dropped significantly, as I just mentioned. Michael Liebrecht from Bloomberg New Energy Finance this last year said, if you aren't planning on 2-cent solar, you're basically not in the game. Okay, great opportunities. There's a utility out in the Midwest. They're in Minnesota largely, and in Colorado, XL. They did an all requirements RFP, a request for proposals, request for RFP, request for proposals. Yeah, thanks. I was just request for permission, but I already went to the bathroom. All right. Anyway, all requirements. Tell us what you got, how much it is, and they got a huge amount of response. And what they did get is solar coming in at less than 3 cents a kilowatt hour. They got dozens and dozens of submissions saying, we can provide you with this, okay? And with wind coming in at less than 2 cents. That was last year. And so what they did was develop a plan on the basis of those figures. Well, what's quite interesting is that in the interim, they've come in with wind that's even lower, okay? Closer to 1 cent. And solar, that's much lower. Storage, that's a lot lower. And what it's caused them to do is accelerate the retirement of 2 fossil plants 10 years ahead of time, okay? The point here of all this is that renewables that we always thought were very clean now are very cheap and competitive and available. Batteries. The price of batteries have dropped precipitously, okay? They've gone from being about $1,100 down to less than $200 a kilowatt hour. The state of Nevada, this is a really interesting trend. Solar there is less than the operating costs of coal and gas. And storage, this is the Utility Commission saying, please go out and find out what the prices are. These are the regulators recognizing that there are these opportunities. So one of the big mega trends is that the power sector is getting very clean, and these clean resources are affordable, okay? But I don't know if it's half the battle, but that's just part of the battle. The idea is, how do you manage this stuff? How do you shape these supplies so you can use them the best way you can? How do you manage the people who are going to need this electricity and want to use it for an electric vehicle or to heat water? How are you going to manage them? That's the challenge of electrification. So there's electrification, then there's beneficial electrification. That's at one of the main points that I'd like to toss out with you all today. Very self-serving slide here. Is all electrification created equal? It's not. There's this term used, tossed around a lot, utility death spiral. Utilities, people are getting so efficient with their energy use and demand is flat and utilities are in a death spiral. So electrification is a solution to that. We can just sell a lot more electricity. This will be great, okay? That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about electrifying everything either. What we're talking about is something a little different. What makes beneficial electrification beneficial? What we propose are 3 criteria. And we propose these for folks to start the discussion. We propose these criteria for you to begin to talk about how this fits with the programs that you've got and the benefit cost structures that are in place. We make the point that there are 3 criteria, and that for a program or an effort to be beneficial, it has to be positive for one of those and not negatively affect the other 2. First, it has to save consumers money over the life of that investment. Second, it has to reduce environmental impacts. And third, and very important, it has to enable grid management. And we'll talk about these 3. And as you can see, There are a bunch of publications that go into much greater detail about that. The first of that series of papers goes into a number of principles that we think are important to inform how you understand these three conditions that we've just set out, and I'll just touch on a couple of the principles to give you a flavor for that. The first is put efficiency first. Efficiency is always cleaner. Chances are efficiency is going to be lower cost than almost anything else you can do. And when, even in the case of electrification, you look at adding more kilowatt hours, for example, ironically, if the source of that fuel, if the source of that electricity being generated is clean, then what you're doing is actually using less, you're creating less environmental damage and potentially using less energy overall, even if you are using more kilowatt hours to run your car, let's say, or to heat water. So efficiency first. Very simple example with automobiles. You can change these figures. This is a little bit old. A gallon of gas is 120 joules, J-O-U-L-E-S, of energy, okay? So you get 25 miles to the gallon, 30 miles to the gallon, fine. With an electric car, you'll get about 110 miles equivalent to that gallon, okay? So we're talking a significant factor. Far more efficient to move around on the landscape, at least with a passenger car today, doing it electrically, right? Second principle, recognize the value of flexible load for grid operations, okay? I ask this question to folks, and I'm always sort of stepping out on a limb here a little bit, but how many of you gone to Florida to visit your grandmother and gone out to dinner at 4:30 in the afternoon? Thank you, Don, thanks. I set up Don here, no, thank you. Okay, why? Because your grandmother's really smart, and because restaurants realize that they have flexibility. Notice, just like a utility system, restaurants are set up for peak, right? 7 o'clock to 10 o'clock at night, everybody piles in, the place is mobbed, and they serve dinner. But they realize that they actually can get people at 4:30 in the afternoon, right? The building's there, the food's paid for, the chef's there, the wait staff's there, all the tables are set out, the linen's folded, et cetera. So why not get people in earlier? What do? They price it a little differently, and they advertise, and people say, I'll have dinner at 4:30 in the afternoon. Why do I use this example? It's because utilities for the first time are in that situation, okay? Historically, a basic rule, utility sector rule, is that you have to generate electricity at virtually the same time you consume it. You gotta generate it when you consume it. But if you have storage in the form of a big water tank, it doesn't matter when you take your shower that you charge it 5 minutes before or 5 hours before. If you have an electric battery, can charge in the middle of the night while everybody's sleeping, and power is cheap, okay? You're not exacerbating the peak times when power is most expensive. You're taking advantage of these cheap opportunities in the middle of the night. And so we're gonna have a quiz question at the end. Is your grandmother really smart? Okay, just a heads up there. It's important to be able to manage this load. Okay, here's a picture. Horizontally, this is 24 hours. Vertically, this is kilowatts. And what you've got are 4 red spikes. That's an electric water heater. This is the Pacific Northwest during the winter, a home in the Pacific Northwest. In the middle, you have this green. It's got some solar on the roof. Okay, now notice the solar on the roof there's not a whole lot in the Pacific Northwest, obviously, but there's nothing corresponding with the water heating that goes on. What if you can take those spikes and move them toward the middle of the day? You can. You can control that water heat and do it. Okay, here's a case where, of course, that we're not doing that. How many of you have seen this? This is called the duck curve. Okay, I apologize for those of you who have seen it a million times. Vertically, you have 24 hours. Horizontally, the 24-hour day. Vertically, the amount of capacity that needs to be brought on in the California market. And it looks like a duck because they keep adding, with their renewable portfolio standard, more solar in the middle of the day. And so the utility doesn't have to provide its generation, it's all this solar that's in the middle of the day. But notice that between the belly and the head of that duck, there's a lot that has to be brought on, a lot of oftentimes fossil resources that have to be brought on. And what you're trying to do is respond to that challenge. There are a couple ways of doing it. What you can do is move that belly upward. How do you do that? Well, you could have fleet charging, workplace charging in the middle of the day, okay? And so if you raise that up and if you soak up those resources in the middle of the day, there will be less of a distance when they have to get up to the peak time. And of course, you can also reduce that peak by having more energy efficient resources available, especially those related to the kitchen, because everybody gets home at night and does stuff in the kitchen, okay? So the idea of flexibility is a second principle that's really important. And flexibility is where, the reason it's the most important thing is because there's cheap electricity in the middle of the night. And if you can charge your car, if you can heat your water in the middle of the night, and the regulator is doing their job, they're going to ensure that the company takes advantage of that cheap electricity and through rates encourages you to take advantage of it and allows you to save money while you're doing that. I'm going to move along a little quickly here. One slide here, understand the emissions effect of changes in load. So you have two states illustrated here, Texas and California. And so if you're charging in the evening in Texas, you're going to be using a certain type of resource, probably gas, okay, a fossil resource. But if you're charging off-peak, chances are you're going to use a lot of wind because they have a load of wind there, okay, and nobody else will be using it. It's sort of the same point that I just made about flexibility. Same deal in California. 7 p.m., they're bringing on all this gas to meet that peak, okay? But in the middle of the day, in the belly of the duck, there's an opportunity to get this electricity without worrying about added emissions. The sixth principle has to do with rate design. And rate design is just a utility sector way of saying, if you get the price right, you'll get people to do certain things. Get the price right, your grandmother's going to read about it in the newspaper and go to the 4:30 early bird special, okay? There's no difference between that and charging your EV, charging your hot water. That's essentially the point here. And there's another shameless advertisement for a rap publication. The idea with rate design is to get people to think about making choices on their individual bill that's consistent with what you want to see the utility doing, cleanest, least cost. And here are a couple pictures of rate designs that I'm not going to put you through. Okay, so let me just sort of wind this up here. If it's not beneficial, don't do it. What do I mean by that? You want to save consumers money because there is that opportunity, okay? For a charging program to come out and cost people more money than what they're paying, obviously, is backwards and not a sensible approach. Enabling better grid management, as I just pointed out, is the key to this, right? And reducing environmental impacts, you can take this load, it's flexible, move it off peak. You can take it to times when people aren't using wind, match it up. Does your RPS, for example, say, well, you got renewables, have you got any way of matching your electric charging, your hot water charging with renewables, okay? Take advantage and you'll reduce the negative environmental effects, okay? That's basically the test. I'm going to leave you with this last observation, and that is that things happen really fast. And those of you who've looked at this at all have seen these Tony Seba slides. Fifth Avenue, Easter, 1900. It's all horses, right? If you scrutinize this, like the Zapruder film, you'll find there's a car there. Okay, we're not going to go into it. Right. Okay. 13 years later, Easter, a couple streets over, it's all cars, right? And there's one horse. I'm not going to worry about that. So I hope you get a sense that there's some really interesting opportunities. We're going to drill down on these topics a little bit more. Again, welcome. It's great to have you here. Have a great day.
All right, well, I'm going to invite our first panel up and do some introductions while we get everyone seated. My plan had been to be the funny person, but David's already taken that role, so I will work on my professorial techniques instead. So, I'm going to my name is Mark James. I'm an assistant professor here and a senior research fellow in the Institute for Energy and the Environment. I'm going to, in a couple seconds, show a slide that's going to make my students cringe because it was on their final exam. We actually asked them, I teach our introductory energy policy class, and asked them a question about beneficial electrification. So I think I saw Nicole, Charlie, Charlotte. I'm fairly certain you now have a better answer to the question, but you did fairly well in the exam to start off with, so congratulations. So we have, we're going to move our discussion today to what David talked about in a, this is the one slide I get to show. So we're going to move our discussion into talking about some of the sectors. I'm focusing on transportation and on buildings and thinking about these, what I call the difficult to decarbonize sectors. That they pose some challenges that require a blend of policy, law, technology, social science to overcome. So we're going to solve all those issues in less than an hour and a half. Be quite fascinating to do that. But I'm putting up here. This is the estimated U.S. energy consumption, and all of the slides will be available. The event's being recorded. That'll be available. We'll post all the slides on our website at the same time. Everyone who's registered to attend will get an email notifying them of that. So this is the U.S. energy consumption estimated for 2017, and on the left side are all the different energy sources. And it's not electricity, this is all energy. So we have petroleum is the biggest one, the green on the bottom, and that's going into transportation, partially into some industrial processes. We have coal, natural gas. So to echo on David's point, the light gray on the right-hand side is the wasted energy. The dark gray is the useful energy. So things wasted in waste heat, leakages, those type of losses that occur. So when I look at this, I see opportunities, and now we're going to talk about the challenges of getting those opportunities into place. So joining me to do that today, we have Karen Glickman, who is a senior manager at the Center for Sustainable Energy. To her immediate left is Sue Coakley, the executive director of NEEP, the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships, which is a regional energy efficiency organization. And then at the end is Jordan Stutt, who is the Carbon Programs Director at the Acadia Center. So Karen and Jordan are going to discuss some of our transportation challenges and some other issues that come up, and Sue's going to be kicking us into our buildings discussion, which is, there's a lot. And we will get into, hopefully we'll get into covering all of that. And the important part is we're going to talk about this, and if we don't talk about it, it's your job to question us about it. It's the equity issues that come up. I think that's an important element of this discussion, and it needs to be at the forefront of that as we think about the environmental impacts, the economic impacts, that if we neglect the equity issues, that we raise the issue that we'll be repeating past practices and past behaviors. So we're going to have Karen come up and start. I'm going to get her slides ready.
All right. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to see so many Familiar and friendly faces. I'm Karen Glitman. I'm with the Center for Sustainable Energy. It's a new position. I've started there. It's been all of a month. So it's been an exciting transition to join this organization. It's a 20-year-old national mission-driven nonprofit. Does a lot of work that I'll describe briefly just to give you some familiarity, but it's focused on decarbonizing buildings and transportation. I'll be focusing mostly on the transportation work because I think that's one of the relevant components for here today. But I also wanted to put this work within a broader context. We know, based on the IPCC report, as well as many other reports, that the time is up. We also know that there's this growing inequity in the world, and I think of three buckets of work. There's the work we're doing and talking about today, which is reducing the emissions we put into the atmosphere. There's the other bucket of work, which is taking the emissions that are in the atmosphere out, and I think that's the subject of the agricultural conversation going on down the hall. And then there's a resiliency bucket of work, which is ensuring that our buildings, our communities, and our people are resilient in the face of climate change. And throughout those three buckets, equity needs to be front and center and needs to be considered as part of the program design and not an add-on. I'll talk a little bit about the work we do on electric vehicles in California that has a very specific disadvantaged community requirement and does some very interesting work there that's verified and been going on for a number of years. So let me start off. Did I just click here? Maybe not. There. Okay. So these are 4 statewide electric vehicle rebate programs that we administer. We'll be starting a 5th in Oregon shortly. There's the California, which of course is the big behemoth. And these sort of give you a description in a sense for those of you who are looking at program design, different incentive levels for different types of vehicles that are in play. So it's the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project, which is the California program. More EV is the Massachusetts program. Cheaper is the Connecticut program, which also includes an auto dealer training component, and then the New York State program, which as well has auto dealer as well as EVs. There is work going on with medium and heavy duties. These focus on light duty vehicles, but I think that's an important piece to consider as well, is the medium and heavy duty component of this. So just to give you a sense of how different programs are structured. So where are we in Vermont in terms of sales? So I took this off of the Auto Alliance website, which is a great website if you want national data. It has data for every state as well as national on EV and all advanced technology sales. You can see this is at the end of 2018. For battery electric and plug-in hybrid electric, we're just under 3,000 vehicles in Vermont that have been sold. So that sort of tells you, this next sort of shows you from 2011 on. So that's the other thing you can get at this website. You can get a temporal time series for how sales have been going. You see that big spike in 2017 was likely due to Nissan's Fleet Tail deal where they offered the 10,000 rebate. But that shows you the maximum there was around 800, maybe 900 vehicles that were sold in that year. It's interesting to see the seasonality of those, the monthly sales of the ATVs, the advanced technology vehicles. That may include hybrid electric. I did not include those in the total sales because I think that's not the subject of today around beneficial electrification. So there is seasonality to vehicle sales, which is a consideration as well. So here are from 2013 to 2018, the top states for sales, and there is Vermont at 4.05%, breaking into the top 10. So that's an important consideration that Vermont has really been stellar in this program and how well it's done in terms of pushing forward the alternative technology vehicles, the plug-in vehicles. So people often ask about what type of vehicles are available. This is at the end of 2018. There were 42 zero-emission vehicles for sale. That list keeps growing. Automakers are making more and more commitments to bring new vehicles and new models to the market. So we'll just see that going on. When people ask how many vehicles are there, right now there's probably more than 42. This is at the end of 2018, and you can expect that list to grow with some of the announcements from the major automakers of their plans to go all electric. Now, how are we doing compared to goals and commitments? I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this in the next two slides. Folks may remember a couple years ago, the zero-emission vehicle states made a commitment, Vermont was one of them, to have 3.3 million electric vehicles on the road by 2025, I think it was. We're nowhere near. Not even close, right? So if you looked at Vermont's goal within that 3.3 million was about 40,000 vehicles. We're at 3,000. So what we see is great commitments, great goals, great aspirations. We see it on whether it's EVs, greenhouse gas reductions, renewable energy. It's almost an arms race. You have this governor of New York saying they're going to be all renewable by 2040 in the electricity sector. Then the mayor of DC says, we're doing it by 2032. And so you just have this continuation of goals and commitments, which is the first step and an important step. But I think what we need to talk about more today is how we take it from goals and aspirations to action on the ground. There's an old saying that's attributed to Eisenhower, where he said, vision without funding is just a hallucination. And there are two corollaries to that. One which is attributed to Edison, which is vision without execution is just hallucination. And then the final one is vision without broad public support is just hallucination. So I think we need those three elements. We've got the commitments, we've got the goals. We're pretty close to having broad public support. We know how to execute a lot of these programs, and in many jurisdictions, what's missing is the commitment in terms of funding. So going back to goals and commitments, so this I just did a straight line of where we are in 2018, which is just a little bit above zero. If we looked at the goals to meet the 2025 Paris commitments, that Vermont has signed on to, the estimate in one of the pathways there is that we'd need 90,000 vehicles, which is an increase of about 12,000 vehicles, about 12,500 vehicles per year. So that we need to grow that adoption rate by about 65% a year. So the question for policymakers is how do we go from our commitments and our goals, from where we are today, to just doing a straight line of what we would need to do to get us there. It's a massive ramp up. I showed you that the highest annual was about 800 plug-in vehicles. This shows that we need about 12,000 a year, just a straight line. That's a massive change. And we know that most people in Vermont and nationally do not buy new vehicles. The much larger market is the used vehicle market. So we know we need to get these plug-in vehicles in the new market so that they can filter down to the used car market, which gets to some of the equity considerations as well. So I know we just have a short time so we can have more time for questions and answers. So I'll just leave it with CSE's missions, which I think is something we can all share, this notion of how do we accelerate. That's part of the conversation today. We know what the bucket of solutions are. We know the tools that are there. We know that government policy and markets can make those change happen. What we need is that lever in the middle, that gear in the middle that takes those government policies and markets and links them with all of those solutions to that actually accelerate this transition. So I look forward to the conversation and dialogue, and we'll turn it over to the next.
This. Great. Good morning. Thank you all for coming out today. Fortunately, we had nice weather, making it an easy drive. Before I talk about building decarbonization, which is really what I'm going to get into, I want to ask how many of you have a heat pump in your house? All right, that's the majority. How many of you either have a plug-in hybrid using electricity or have an electric car? Raise your hand. Okay. So I'm talking to people who know a lot about this. The journey to decarbonization is actually a deeply personal one. It will affect every single one of us, how we live our life every day, what we drive, how we get from here to there by transportation, and how we heat our homes and cool them. So it's very important to know, where you are with that. I certainly have adopted these technologies. So let me talk a little bit first about Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships. We call it NEEP. NEEP has been around for 22 years. We are a regional organization dedicated to accelerating energy efficiency as a core resource solution in the Northeast region. We have had many successes over these 22 years, including with Vermont. Vermont has great aspirations, and when Vermont works with New York and all of New England and all of the Mid-Atlantic states, we change things big time in the country and in the world, and I'm not just saying that. We were a huge part of market transformation for lighting, and leadership here has established a whole new market. But Vermont could not do it by itself. NEEP provides a framework to align our work, learn from each other, and advance policies. So we've been doing that for 22 years, and 3 years ago, we recognized that states had adopted a larger policy. Most of our work had been about least cost gas and electricity and a regulatory framework and helping to drive those solutions. But also now today it's about carbon reduction. So we moved looking at efficiency in the context of a larger public policy umbrella of reducing carbon emissions. And our work now is focused particularly on building decarbonization while others are working on transportation. So when we began to really think about electrification and what it meant and efficiency in our region, we realized that our region had pretty much all lined up with 80% carbon reduction by 2050, a mighty goal. And in fact, many have agreed that it's 40% by 2030. We have to get there halfway. How are we doing? Well, we've done a lot of good things in making our grid more renewable. We've really reduced the carbon footprint with RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, purchases of renewables. But when we look at our total carbon emissions across our economy, we're nowhere close in terms of where we need to go. We've made some headway, 17% change over the past 17 years, but we need to go much further. And see, this is an animation there. There we go. 76% change really to get by 2050. So we have a long way to go. We stepped back to say, where does that come from? And it really comes from the next piece from our transportation and our buildings. So we did an electrification opportunity assessment for New England, New York. And this is what we came up with, that the largest amount of carbon reduction, 76% of it, is really coming from our direct use of fossil fuels in homes, buildings, and transportation. But there are technologies that enable that. You all know that. You're adopting that. You are a bit of the converted already, but we need to bring this to scale. The solutions exist, but not broadly. The other thing I wanted to, sort of key principle I wanted to bring to your attention is when we shift away from direct use of fossil fuels, particularly in the building sector, there's really 3 things we need to do. So David talked about some of these. I'm going to frame it a little bit differently, but first in the middle is deep energy efficiency. We need to use only the energy we really need to be comfortable and to transport ourselves. We need to then shift from our use of fossil fuels, once we've right-sized our use of energy, to using things like heat pumps and heating. I'm going to talk about the building sector. There are some other thermal renewable solutions, but largely it looks like heat pumps for space and water heating in thermally efficient buildings. Because we're essentially moving our fossil fuel purchase, which comes to us mostly in Vermont, in trucks, right? It's all basically roadways delivering that fossil fuel. We're moving that delivery to our grid. So David talked about how do we make better use of our grid. Basically, most of our grid is used at a capacity factor about 30% at any particular moment. We have those peaks, but much of the time, it's only about 30, maybe 35% utilization. Most assets in a business framework wouldn't continue to be used if that's what it was, so it's very underutilized. As we shift those truckloads of oil and propane to our grid, we can do it in such a way that improves that utilization factor, and so we're making better use of the underutilized roadway, essentially, or grid, and not adding to the peaks. So that means we need to make homes and buildings smart. They need to have the ability to talk to the grid. In Vermont, you have automated meter infrastructure, so you already have a way to do that. What we need to do is have the house and building side be able to talk to it. So now my next technology question, who has a Nest thermostat in their house here? Okay, not many. A Nest thermostat can be a smart thermostat that can talk to the grid, and it can make the house go on pause. David Farnsworth talked about water heating as a way to shift load. If your house is thermally efficient, it can go on pause for an hour without a heat input and still be quite comfortable. And a Nest thermostat allows you to set your comfort points to where you want and allow the grid to operate it. So we need to make buildings efficient, thermally efficient. We need to shift to heat pumps, and we need to be grid integrated. And all three conditions are necessary to get to our decarbonization. When we think about what that looks like in the residential sector, just looking at New York and New England, building from the opportunity assessment that we did, we have 14.6 million homes in New York and New England. And that's 20% of our regional carbon emissions. There's also the commercial industrial sector. 75%, this is just based on census data, were built before there was a building any code of any kind, 1980. And really, many of them were built without still much of an energy code, so they're not very efficient. So 80% of those buildings need improvement to be thermally efficient, smart, and have thermal renewable heating. We estimate that it will cost between $5,000 and $30,000 or more per home to actually do that. Why? Because when we do efficiency, we have to fix our homes and buildings. You can't put insulation in without fixing the roof, you can't put new windows in without doing structural improvements. So that number that I talk about is actually improving our houses and buildings, particularly our houses, in a significant way. There are multiple benefits when we do that. When we insulate our homes, we make them healthier, we make them more comfortable, we make them more safe, we make them more resilient. Last year, you can all remember the polar vortex when it hit us around Christmas, New Year's. Many people had frozen pipes. Raise your hand if you knew somebody had frozen pipes. Everybody knows somebody had frozen pipes. It cost us hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars on our economy over that week because of the frozen damage. A well-insulated house is resilient and can benefit. So as we electrify, as we decarbonize, we're improving our building stock that has multiple benefits, and this is key, because it's not going to be inexpensive. There will be total lower costs for everybody, but it could cost our region $200 to $300 billion to make this improvement across New York, New England. But we spend $13 billion a year buying fuels, and that money leaves our economy. That's gas and delivered. So we can stop sending that money out of our economy and keep putting it into our houses and have a whole lot more benefit. So this is maybe our most critical, economic picture that I want you to come away with. So I was asked to say, so what are some of the policies? All the policies in one slide. I will just give you a very high-level picture. First of all, and this is something Karen was talking about, statewide carbon reduction goals. You need to make it the law. You need to make it the requirement. We are going to do this because everything follows from that. And you do need to be aspirational, and then you do need to put the real, plan in place and actually do it. There's utility regulation pieces. David talked a bit about rate design. We need efficiency programs to support whole building efficiency, carbon reduction, making them smart. We need utility regulation to make smart buildings and smart grid a profitable investment and a good thing for consumers. We need building standards. We need advanced building codes, passive house designs, this kind of thing for our new buildings. In Pennsylvania, all affordable housing that is procured by the state actually meets passive house standards right now and is very cost effective. Building energy rating and disclosure is very important because we need to know how much energy our houses use. Karen put up slides about, the changes in our fleet and where we're going. We don't know how we change our houses and buildings until we know what their energy performance is. So home and building energy labeling and disclosure is critical. Montpelier just passed an important law about this last month. And then we need to move to making building improvements at time of sale or lease. Burlington's been doing this for a long time for the low-income sector. We need community leadership to make our buildings and homes, our public buildings, efficient and low carbon. We need supporting policies, including the procurement of renewable energy for the grid, the advancement of energy storage, the leading by example, workforce development, shifting and making this investment in our homes and buildings requires new skills and capabilities. We need centers for excellence that build that capability in our workforce across the region. We need financing, particularly for low income, and there's a whole lot of policy linkages. We're not doing this in a vacuum. It's about energy affordability, healthcare, economic and community development. I won't go over this, I'll leave it behind for you, but there is leadership happening all across our region. Vermont is a leader, the District of Columbia is a leader, Massachusetts, New York, Rhode Island, and indeed, I would say some of the smaller states, like the District of Columbia, not quite a state, but I call it a state, Vermont, Rhode Island, are actually moving faster to change policies, and there's a number of reasons why that's possible. And so I'm going to end with this slide because Vermont is one of these small boats that can actually turn much faster. New York is the super tanker here out in the ocean, and they've been trying to do the REV proceeding for, I don't know, what is it, 5 years now, Rich? Something. It's a difference. It's making a big impact, but they can't do it quickly. You all can talk to each other. You can figure out what needs to be done. You can talk to your communities and move it forward. And that's happening in the district, it's happening in Rhode Island, and it can happen here. We have a whole lot more resources at our website, and I will add a slide to my deck that you can learn more about it. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jordan Stutt with Acadia Center. Acadia Center is a small research and advocacy organization focused on clean energy and clean transportation. We are active throughout the Northeast. I'm coming up here from the Boston office today. Thanks to the Vermont Law School and the folks at RAP for bringing me up here. It's a good opportunity to get back to Worthyburger after a couple of years. Excited about that. So jumping into it, I'm going to zoom out a little bit. Let's see, Karen really focused on a lot of the details about what's happening in the EV space, and particularly here in Vermont. But just stepping back a little bit, it is a really exciting time in the transportation electrification space. The major global automakers have invested, as of last year, over $90 billion in EVs. The companies that are focused on fueling our transportation, the oil majors, like Shell and BP, have both purchased electric charging companies in the last year. They see the writing on the wall. EV growth is happening very quickly. Last year in the US, EV sales increased by 81%. It's very exciting, but there are a lot of caveats, and we have a lot of work to do. One of those caveats that I've been hearing from folks who know more about the sector than I do is that growth was really boosted primarily by a glut of Tesla Model 3s that came onto the market last year after a long wait list had developed. So if we want to see continued really high-speed growth, we've got a lot to do. And the chart on the right is from Acadia Center's Energy Vision 2030 analysis, which looks at New York and New England and the policies and programs that we need to put in place to achieve a 45% or 50% reduction in GHG emissions by 2030. And in the transportation space, our analysis shows that we need about 20% of the fleet to be electric by 2030. Karen mentioned we've got a long way to go to achieve the ZEV targets by 2025. We've got even more work to do to get to our 2030 goals. But there are a lot of policies and programs that we think can help us get there. The EV rebate programs that Karen talked about, time of use rates that utilities need to put in place. Dave did a great job of talking through that. But that's really important when we think about how EV charging happens, making sure that consumers have the right price signals to charge their EVs when it's good for the grid, when it's good for emissions, and when it's good for their energy bills. We need EV-ready building codes, and we need to make sure that the utility EV make-ready programs are really moving forward quickly. That's something that I'm really excited about.
Could you make the
Can I what? I'm worried that I'm going to screw it up if I try to mess with it here, but I can direct you to it online.
Yeah.
And then one of the policies that I'm most excited about now, and one that really complements all of these other things, is the idea of a regional cap and invest program for the transportation sector. And that's something that's being discussed through the Transportation and Climate Initiative, or TCI. So TCI represents 12 states from Maine down to Virginia, 13 if we use Sue's classification and include DC. This is a group of states that have been meeting since 2010. State reps from DOTs and environmental agencies have been participating in calls coordinated by the Georgetown Climate Center to really figure out what are the strategies that we need to put in place to reduce pollution from the transportation sector, which is by far the largest source of CO2 emissions in the region. And in December of last year, a subset of those states, 9 of those states, agreed to develop a cap and invest program for the transportation sector, and they're going to be working on that in 2019. And this would really build on the success that these states have had through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, the cap and invest program for the electric sector. There's a lot of overlap between this map and the map of the RGGI states, with the nice new additions of Pennsylvania, and hopefully we'll be bringing Virginia and New Jersey into RGGI soon. And just putting this group into a broader perspective, the GDP of those dark green states, the ones that have committed to developing this program, is over $3 trillion. That would be the world's 5th largest economy. And it would bring 254 million tons of CO2 under this cap that would decline each year to make sure that we achieve our long-term targets. That's 4 times the size of RGGI. If we include those light green states that are part of TCI but haven't yet signed on to this agreement, it would become the world's 3rd largest economy. So this has real heft to it. It's not just the symbolic state or subnational action that you hear a lot about. This is a real driver of change, both in terms of the way that we get around, the way that we deliver transportation options to people, but also in terms of our climate and local pollution impacts. And so the policy details of this program will be worked out over the course of 2019. But when we think of this really in terms of the RGGI model, that allowances would be created and auctioned off by the states. If we assume an allowance price in the ballpark of what's happening in Quebec and California, where they already have a cap and invest program for the transportation sector, the floor price is around $15 per ton. So looking at this region, that would bring in about $3.8 billion per year for reinvestment. In Vermont alone, that would be about $51 million per year to be reinvested in clean transportation. That's not enough to solve all of the state or the region's transportation needs, but it can go a really long way in advancing beneficial transportation electrification. And this graphic is, I'm not going to quiz anybody on the content of it. This is something that we put on the back of our community energy vision. It's you unfold it and it becomes a nice poster. But I think it really captures this idea that there are so many stakeholders that need to be involved in this conversation. There's so many ways that people depend on the transportation network. We need to be thinking really broadly. And transportation investment is going to be a really key strategy in that broader investment portfolio. But it's not the only challenge that we're facing in the transportation sector. We need to think beyond just switching people and fleets from combustion engines to electrification. We certainly need to be thinking about mode shift, how we can make alternatives to the car more attractive to people, whether that's public transportation or walking and biking, or a suite of other options. We also really need to be focused on the equity issue. And that's equity in terms of pollution and who faces the largest burden of pollution, in terms of who faces the biggest risk from climate change and the communities that are most vulnerable, but also who faces the biggest costs from health effects of transportation pollution. Springfield, Mass. Has been dubbed the asthma capital of the country. Boston is number 10 in the country in asthma incidents. We need to do better, and a lot of the challenge there is that the pollution that's causing those asthma cases is from our transportation sector. And so when we think about how we invest these funds to improve transportation options, we need to be focused on how we can address that issue in terms of health outcomes. One example that I'm really excited about is what's happening in Rhode Island. The Rhode Island Public Transit Authority has put their first few electric transit buses on routes that primarily serve environmental justice communities. So it's a small start, but I think it's a great demonstration of how electrification of transportation can be used to deliver its greatest impacts in communities that have faced the greatest burden so far. We also need to be thinking about equity in terms of access to transportation. In urban and suburban environments, we're seeing the cost of living skyrocket, the cost of housing is skyrocketing, particularly in the city closest to the jobs, but also along public transit routes. So people, particularly low-income communities, are being displaced from access to transportation, access to jobs. A recent Harvard study showed that long commute times are the largest impediment to economic mobility. So if we really want to achieve a just transition here and make sure that all communities are part of the solution, we need to be thinking about how to expand this transportation network to those communities. And in more rural environments, like in Vermont and much of New England, if you can't drive a car, whether it's because you can't afford to own a car, because your license is suspended, or if you're physically unable to drive a car, you really lose independence. And that's a major issue. So we need to be thinking about investments that can help drive better alternatives in rural regions. And then when it comes to how we make those investment decisions, I think it's critically important that the people and the communities that are most affected by these inequities in the transportation system are at the table to help make those decisions. So they're sitting alongside the policymakers, the businesses, the transportation experts, and the advocates. I'm really excited about a meeting that's going to be happening in Massachusetts in about a week and a half. It'll be the first meeting of a coalition that's focused on TCI, and it's being co-convened by Acadia Center as an environmental group, Transportation for Massachusetts, which is a coalition of transportation organizations, and the Green Justice Coalition, a coalition of social justice, environmental justice, and labor groups. So all of these groups are coming together on equal footing to really figure out the parameters of what it means to be advocating around this program, thinking through holistically how we need to be targeting investments to achieve an equitable, low-carbon, modern transportation system. And I think as this program continues to progress, we're going to see more conversations like that, and I think that's critically important. But glad to talk about it more in the Q&A. Thanks.
Hey, Jordan, I got a question for you. Can you tease out the idea of long commute times and the effect they have on social mobility a little bit more? You just touched on it.
Sure. Is this on? Yeah. So I can walk to work, which is a huge benefit for me in Boston. I never have to worry about unreliable public transit or impacts of weather. I can get to my job and be there, and it's reliable. Somebody who relies on public transit has good access in a city like Boston, but they're still vulnerable to impacts. The T is not great, it needs a whole lot of investment. And if people show up to work late, they're less likely to keep their jobs. That becomes exacerbated when people don't have access to public transit. They can't walk, they can't bike to work. When they have to drive an hour and a half in terribly congested roads, it takes up other time that they could be using to spend with their families. It takes up time that they could be at work. It makes them likely to be late to work and lose their jobs. So for people that are already cash-strapped, it's just really difficult to make ends meet when you're facing those additional burdens. So one thing that I didn't touch on that I think is a really critical component here is the availability of affordable housing that's also transit-oriented, so that we are making sure that people have access to the commuter rail, to public transit, even if they're not wealthy, well-to-do people. So making sure that everybody's got a fair shot to get to the job centers.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, when I was at the Transportation Research Center at UVM going back 8+ years ago, there was an interesting study around new Americans around this exact issue. And when it takes you 3 hours to go do your grocery shop because you have to get on transit to get there, what happens is you miss out on social, on civic, and then economic opportunities. So the longer it takes for you to meet your daily basic needs, not just your commute time, but your ability to participate in your schools, in your child's school activities. If you don't have that access to mobility, and it's going to take you 3 hours, you're going to lose 3 hours from work. It has a massive economic effect. So that's an interesting perspective. This study looked at new Americans specifically in Vermont that could be of interest to folks. You're right.
Hello, my question is from my friend Sue Coakley. I was really interested in the factoid that you rattled off, that you think that around New England, 80% of homes need energy retrofits that cost in the neighborhood of $5,000 to $30,000 per home. My credit union in New Hampshire just made the bold announcement, getting out front of all the other credit unions in New Hampshire, that it will make energy loans to members of up to $5,000. That's a problem from my standpoint, and from where I sit and stand, access to credit and willingness to borrow money of consumers is a serious impediment to the kind of energy transformation we need in the residential sector. You mentioned briefly this question of finance, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what we could do to make borrowing more realistic for consumers with respect to energy retrofits.
Thank you for the question, Don. There's really two things we need to do. First, we need to make energy efficiency market relevant. Right now, you know when you buy a car what its miles per gallon is, and you can value that efficiency. I'm going to spend a little more money on a car that's a plug-in hybrid because I'm going to get the better mileage, and I want that. And I'll spend a little more money. When you buy a house or rent a house or apartment or condo, you don't know anything really about what its energy requirements are. And even if you went ahead and got an audit done, you would say, I want to borrow the money. You'd say, well, what is that going to give you? So what we need to do is put a rating on our houses and buildings. There's a thing called a home energy score, home energy rating. There's several different flavors out there. And by having a rating on the house, that you can say we're moving from, an inefficient rating to a higher rating, you know that you're creating value because people are very clear what that value translates into. So rating is the first thing, the first condition, so that markets, investors, banks, lenders can understand what you're doing and what you're improving. I'll give you one little factoid about something here in Vermont. NEEP has been working on a 3-year project with the Department of Public Service and a five-state project to automate the availability of home energy scores to the marketplace, multiple, listing service, Trulia, Zillow. And when houses that have a rating is included in a property listing, we've been doing it since April. We made this operational in April. In 4 states, it's very clear that people are buying those houses when those houses are on the market for a shorter period of time, significantly shorter period of time. They're selling for a little more money, whether or not they have a good rating, because people say, I know what it is, I understand it, it's market relevant, right? So we need to make efficiency market relevant. So then lending institutions, one, can understand what we're talking about as we move from A to B, hopefully to an Energy Star home, for example. So that's one thing. The other thing is we do need to make sure financing is available for everyone. And we've talked here a lot about energy justice. So there's going to be different financing mechanisms and pathways for different types of consumers. We know that low-income people typically live in the worst housing, right? It's the leakiest, it's in the greatest need of improvement. It's going to be the most costly, right? It's going to be more than $5,000 done. So we have weatherization programs that need to be modified to actually look at total performance and low carbon. That's a big shift, and that should be a public focus. Then we need to make funding available for businesses and homeowners, really, across the board. So PACE is a way to do that. There's programs like that. There are arrangements like you have in Vermont, the Vermont State Employees Credit Union. I love the credit union. Provides low BEIC or Efficiency Vermont, actually I should say Efficiency Vermont has bought down the cost of basically that loan, so you can have a lower price. You actually borrow more money in Vermont than you can in New Hampshire. So the lending institutions need to understand the value of it, that it's a very low risk loan. I should say the default rate is 0.2%, so it's a very low risk loan, and we need to make that financing available. So legislators and states and communities, really need to work with the lending institutions to put these programs in place, and we need to put in home energy rating so that lenders and consumers can understand what they're trying to achieve and how they can value that.
Do you have a question?
Hi, thanks. Sue, well, all of you, I was also taken by your $200 billion to upgrade the homes and the $31 billion or whatever that's going out of the region annually for the fossil fuels
buy.
expenditures.
Just for heating.
Right, for heating. It seems to me that in order to get decision makers to make the right choices and the public to accept them as well, we have to make really strong economic arguments, and that in addition to those savings, there's a whole lot of externalities and the costs of those that need to be taken into consideration in those arguments made, the costs of infrastructure repairs due to climate change, health and safety issues for low-income people and others. And I'm just wondering, on all the issues, home weatherization, home electric heating, transportation, are we making those arguments, and can we make those so that when we bring those to the policymakers, we can have those costs too?
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, that we need to actually value those other benefits, the health benefits, the safety benefits. When you're not burning a fossil fuel in your house, you don't need a CO monitor, right? People actually do die every year of our carbon monoxide poisoning. So we need to be able to quantify those benefits. There's actually very good work going on at the Harvard School of Public Health, also at BU, that's quantifying these. And NEEP has on its website a bunch of studies that get at the health, safety, resilience types of benefits. And these are beginning to be captured in the cost effectiveness analysis for efficiency programs. Massachusetts passed a law last August that expanded the cost effectiveness analysis for these ratepayer funded programs to include the multiple value streams. But we also have to win the hearts and minds of people, right? They need to believe and understand it really will make improvement. We also have programs, actually something that's just begun in Vermont, it's been happening in Massachusetts and a couple of other states, where healthcare institutions, doctors are actually writing prescriptions for efficiency retrofits for people who have respiratory illness. So we need to begin to make these kinds of connections very directly. We need to, again, get beyond just looking at framing as energy policy.
Yeah, I would just add on the transportation side, there's a long history and body of work on the impacts, the health impacts from emissions. And it would be, as part of gaining this public support, I don't know if there's anyone here from the public health sector, but those are folks that we need to engage early on. They're having these conversations as well, to join forces to bring forth these arguments. They make them very powerfully. They have the data, they've got the documentation of the impacts, not just of the emissions, but also talking about providing people with transportation options, the effects of the sedentary lifestyle that sometimes being in a vehicle can lead to. So I think there's a whole component there that engaging with the public health sector, I think, is an important piece for us moving forward.
And I would also just add, on the public health sector, not only are they really important messengers about the costs of pollution from transportation, but in some ways they're the culprits too. Around Longwood Medical area in the Boston area, there are pharmaceutical delivery vans that are just circling and pumping out diesel. There's really a great opportunity for fleet electrification in that space, and to get those companies a little bit more involved in being part of the solution.
Hi, Karen and Jordan. Karen, I really appreciate the sense of reality that you brought with your presentation, and I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit more about the what other states have done in terms of the best practices and how we can actually help more Vermonters or more of our New England neighbors with accessing electric transportation, whether that's like certain specific elements around customer incentives or other types of things. If you guys could talk about that, it would be helpful.
Yeah, I suspect there's a number of levels. So I think one of the things that immediately comes to mind from an equity perspective is we found that having a cap on the MSRP, the retail price for a vehicle, is more beneficial having a hard cap than trying to do an income cap. It's problematic on the income side, so having a cap on the vehicle price from an equity perspective. Working with auto dealers, they're a critical piece in the supply chain, providing incentives. We do that in Connecticut and New York for auto dealers to make sure that they know about the vehicles, are interested in selling. We know it takes them longer to sell those vehicles and they make less money on it. So part of the role of an incentive is to cover that differential. And then consumer incentives work. The data shows that people will move at certain levels of consumer incentives. You can structure them in a way so that you're incenting those that are dependent on that incentive to purchase the vehicle and try to eliminate some of what is sort of called the free ridership, people who would have purchased it anyway. So there are structures you can do in your program for that. But incentives work, marketing and outreach works. We know if we're going to have 3.3 million EVs in the ZEV MOU states, you need at least 3.3 million test drives to get there. So we need those ride and drives, we need the incentives, we need the marketing and outreach, and we need the dealer engagement. Regulation also helps, which is what the ZEV provides, is that regulation that encourages, and we've seen that transformation by the auto manufacturers to actually provide the vehicles. You need to have the vehicles to purchase as well, so that regulation helps there as well. But I don't know if, Jordan, if you had more to add.
Yeah, I think that's a great list. I would also just add that we were talking about the size of the used car market. As more and more used EVs come to market for sale, we need to make sure that EV rebate programs are applicable to those used vehicles. If we really want low or moderate income people to be able to drive electric vehicles, that's going to be a big part of it. Mm-hmm. And then we also need to be careful about creating unnecessary barriers to EV adoption. I think there's good reason to think about how the increased deployment of EVs will affect gas tax revenues and making sure that we have long-term funding for transportation. EVs are not going to contribute to gas tax, but we've done some analysis that shows that in terms of the life of an electric vehicle, they contribute more to state transportation funds just because right now they're selling at much higher prices, so there's a higher sales tax, higher excise tax, so they're contributing more than their traditional sedans to transportation infrastructure. So we need to make sure that proposals to apply a EV registration fee are fair if they're happening at all. Hopefully they're not happening, and that in the future we're looking at more fair ways to actually make sure that EVs are contributing in an equitable way to the funding needs.
I'm just going to add a quick building solution. Another best practice is in evolving building energy codes to have buildings and homes that are EV ready so that you can basically readily bring a car into that, but also ordinances in towns, cities, that require smart transportation and EV charging to be actually part of that development and give it priority so that you're really preparing for that future. But beyond EV, but also looking at shared transportation and van pools and things like that.
The only other item we didn't talk about was infrastructure, is making sure there's EV charging stations are ubiquitous, they're fast, they're reasonably priced, I think is important as well. And what we're really talking about is the rapid replacement of existing fossil fuel infrastructure in vehicles and in buildings perhaps with the renewables. So that's where the incentives can disrupt the normal pace of transformation by, rather than waiting 10, 12 years to replace your vehicle through a rapid replacement and an incentive, we can encourage folks to do so sooner into a clean, renewably powered vehicle. Yeah.
Hi, Curtis Osler from Vermont Tech. Two questions, if I may. Karen, you had mentioned trying to get the electrical and hybrid vehicles into the used market so people can afford them. But don't we have an issue with battery life? And then what is it, when we get more EVs on the market or on the roads, what about battery disposal? Isn't there an environmental impact to that? That's one question. And then my second question I think for Sue, you had mentioned building codes, and especially for affordable housing. Do we have a risk, and I'm all for it, absolutely, but do we have a risk of discouraging some affordable housing construction if the cost is too expensive because of building codes? How do we balance that out?
So on the batteries, we know that they're getting better, they're getting less expensive, they're getting more powerful, and there's new technologies that are being developed regularly. There is an issue, obviously, with battery degradation over the lifetime, and I think that can get accounted for in the price of a vehicle. But the batteries are seen as having 3 lives. The first is to provide motive power within the vehicle. The second is once that is no longer feasible, the range has been decreased such, some of the automakers working with utilities are using them for storage because they still have value. So then they can be used for storage, and then the third life is recycling. So yes, there's environmental issues with every energy source, but I think that having the 3 lives helps extend the value of that, and the recycling is an important component as well.
So on the housing side and looking at building codes and how do we advance building codes without making it too expensive, making, again, the affordability issue. It's pretty clear that when we change practices to build advanced energy designs in homes and buildings all the way to passive house types of design or passive building, it's really a question of designing it from the beginning. If you design a home and building up front to that, it doesn't necessarily cost more because you avoid a lot of materials that you would otherwise put into that building. So it's a question of it being planned and building capabilities to do that in the marketplace. In Pennsylvania, again, the development of passive house is kind of the standard in the annual procurement of affordable housing for the state, is that they added points at one point because there was one particular firm that was bidding in houses that could meet a passive standard. So the state said, well, why don't we just add points for those buildings that come in? Pretty much all the buildings come in at passive standards, and it doesn't cost any more. So you need to build market capacities, and the last thing I would say that having a state building code vision of how you're going to advance codes over time, so by 2030, for example, that zero energy or zero carbon, however you want to define it, is actually the reality. You give the market time to develop, and you allow the efficiency programs like that by Efficiency Vermont to actually implement and support the advanced standards, sort of moving that stretch code and building market capacities to do it before you make it a requirement for the whole state. And that is working across many states. So it doesn't have to cost more, you just need to plan for it.
Thank you for this panel. My question is about, in developing policy, the tension inherent between mandates and incentives, winning people's hearts and minds. You know, we've spoken about providing agency for people, providing options. Many of us who have that agency want to use it to not worry about when our electric water heater goes on. We want the utility to do that for us. So we have the agency and use it to not deal with the decision making. But that push and pull of voluntary participation versus mandates, can you address that at all?
Well, I would call that the market transformation challenge. And NEEP is a market transformation organization. It's really been working on this. And we have a 30% rule. The 30% rule is if you can build market adoption of something through voluntary programs, and it's a whole range of ways, and overcoming barriers, at 30%, the market has this as a competitive opportunity. It's adopted widely, it's understood by consumers, it's understood by the marketplace. There may be some providers of the technology or service who don't quite do it yet, but 30% of the market is there. At that point, you can begin to make it a requirement. We've done this. We've watched state and federal policy be able to lock in efficiency standards, for example, or new building codes when you get to 30%. So you need to be smart about how you do that. With heat pumps, it's not just getting the technology itself to have more options and to be more cost effective and working hard on that, but it's actually developing capacities to deliver it. It's a new technology, and we need to build that. So you need to get to 30% market capacity to deliver that solution and have a very strong sense from consumers that they really are finding them terrific. I do, but most people have to find that. So 30% is where you want to get to, and the voluntary pathways depend on what it is.
Hi, I'm Tim Roper. I work for a solar integrator here in Vermont, and we also sell and install heat pumps and increasingly EV chargers. And I just wanted, this has been touched on, I think, by the whole panel, but I just want to call this out as an important consideration that one of the obstacles that we run into frequently, sometimes with solar, more often with heat pumps, and very frequently with EV charging installations, is that the electrical infrastructure of our older housing stock here in Vermont can create a pretty costly barrier to actually integrating that EV charger into the home. And it's something that I think needs attention probably within the EV market itself, the dealership network, when they're promoting these vehicles, which hopefully they are. And then again in building code, as we look ahead to revising our building codes. And then lastly, but actually maybe first, in getting financing in place to help support that. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, I guess I would, I know that's an issue, and it's interesting when people ask how much is an EV charger. The actual machine is not that much. It's all going to be dependent on your situation and where your panel is compared to where you want to put the charger, and so there is some issues to be brought up. And it's an important factor because we know that 90% of charging occurs at home. And then workplace charging is the second bucket, and then public charging is the third, much smaller, if you can think of that as a pyramid of charging. So I think it's an issue that needs to be overcome, and I think incentives can be, and financing can be part of the way to get there for folks. So I think you got to wrap that all up in the package to encourage folks to do that market transformation.
Thank you. On the question of equity and thinking in terms of the Washington Electric Co-op, for instance, the price of electricity after you use 200 kilowatt hours in a month goes up to over a quarter. And we have two plug-in electric hybrid vehicles. They average about 6 cents per mile driving on $2.44 gasoline. They're 9 cents per kilowatt per mile on electricity. And in the rural areas where Washington Electric serves, there is no opportunity for public transit, so you got to drive the car. And is there any way to convince the people that do rate structures to provide for the excessive cost of electricity in rural areas?
I suspect there's two sides to that. One is the rate structure from the utility, but we're seeing more and more happening with integration between renewables and storage that can help in some areas address that. So you store it, you produce your own electricity, you store it, and that's how you can perhaps deal with it. But I think the rate structure is an important piece, and I'd have Sue, if you have any thoughts on that.
Oh, well,
Or Jordan.
Yeah, and, or maybe Jordan, are you doing rates on electric vehicles? I mean, I've done a little bit, but maybe you want to dig in on one.
Not as much personally, but organizationally, yeah, we spend a lot of time pushing for time of use rates. Again, as Dave talked through, enabling people to draw electricity from the grid when there's relatively low demand for it and cheap availability. So once you have access to that lower cost electricity, it brings down your overall cost per mile with an EV.
Right, so one of the things with EVs, we know they're a flexible load and they can be controlled, but that doesn't deal with the issue you're raising, which has to do with the total amount of electricity you're using, not when you're using it. So if you have a time of use rate, I think that's one of the pieces. We know it's having the integration and the controllable component, but I think you still need to deal with those blocks from a rate structure.
There's a technology solution and a rate structure solution. And I think I talked about regulatory reform, and certainly RAP talks more about that. Rate designs that recognize that we do need to move our use of fossil fuels to the grid need to understand that we will have increased consumption, and the timing of it makes it beneficial or not, right? And so I think that the Washington Electric Co-op Board should think further about what their goals are and what rate designs are going to support long-term what they need to do. So rate reform is probably important. Demand ratchets encourage you to live within a certain timing of use, but total consumption may well increase as we move away from fossil fuels and electrify it. So I think that's a rate reform issue.
Thank you, Kurt McCormick. This is a wonderful panel. Thank you, extremely informative. My question is, I understand that in Norway, now again, it's not Vermont, but probably ahead of us on electrification of cars, their incentive for the car is tremendous. In Norway, when you purchase any car, a new car, your tax is the price of the car. So if you bought a $25,000 car, that's the tax also. That tax is totally waived if the car is all electric. So an enormous subsidy for the car. But they have found, apparently, that it's a bigger bang for the buck for the ultimate, to getting to electrification, to subsidize charging infrastructure because of range anxiety, even in relatively small Norway. So I'd ask you to just comment on that. Should we consider that here? And then Karen, I think you mentioned just incentives for cars. How much of an incentive do you think you need before it's effective? And effective to me means we get to electrification and to, at some point, be able to remove that subsidy, whatever it is, when we get to 30%.
Right.
So how big does it have to be? How long does it have to last, do you think? And what places, I'm forgetting your first name, I'm sorry. Sue. Sue, if you could talk more about your 30% rule. Really important, I think. I don't know if you remember all those questions, but thank you.
Yeah, so Norway is an incredible example, and it's. I was in Oslo maybe 4 years ago, and it was unusual to see an internal combustion engine on the streets. Everything was either transit bikes or an electric vehicle. They're also banning internal combustion engines within their city center. So there's a number of components there, and they are putting a lot of money into it to make that all happen. So they've got the carrot and the stick that's making that change happen. So they are a rural, cold jurisdiction. There aren't always roads from the ports. You take the ferry up and down to get to places. So there is some similarities to consider. They also have electric ferries in Norway. In terms of the amount, I'd want to go into the data a bit more. We've done some analysis of that at where, and I think it depends also on where the market is, what the incentive level needs to be, and it's different based on income level, what the incentive is appropriate. So if you want to target a certain income level, you might want to have a certain incentive. And then what was the other piece of that? Where, when, so how long? Right, so I think to a certain extent, and we've seen those charts, which gets to Sue's 30%, you want to do it until you have market transformation. And I think that long-term incentive is really critical. Doing an incentive program for a year, starting and stopping, does not send a market signal to consumers, to auto dealers, or to the market in general. You need to have a long-term commitment to transforming the market to be realistic. So I would encourage finding a steady, consistent revenue stream to fund that incentive over a long term. And I can get back to you with what we've found in terms of what that dollar number is. Yeah.
So getting up to that 30%, you need to look at the unique barriers. So there's two barriers on electric cars. One is, are they available in the types that people need an affordable price? The other barrier is the infrastructure to charge it, the range anxiety issue. So you need incentives to deal really with both sides. You want to be able to get more of the right kinds of cars at an affordable price, and that price will come down just like they did in windmills. It's the same thing. It's really more about scale, I think, on the price on EVs. The charging is a different kind of problem. It's less of a price problem. It's more of an availability problem. So when we try to go up to 30% on the market transformation curve, usual first incentives are typically direct to consumer to try to just get some interest and get some market traction going and build some market interest. But you then need to begin to move to what I call more midstream incentives. So rather than just trying to pay every consumer that $25,000 tax break, which sounds very nice for the car, you begin to actually work with the dealers, and you give them incentives to achieve certain kinds of goals, and that has worked very well. I think on the charging infrastructure, what I'm seeing is we're going beyond just like programs and pilots that are encouraging charging to be here and there and in strategic places to procurement of charging. So we see procurement of wind is helped to really bring down the cost of wind, large state-level procurement. So we look at the Volkswagen funding, actually. You see some states are going to actually procuring of charging. And you begin to build a competitive market, not only to provide the equipment, but for the business model for how it will work in the long term. So I think we need to be thoughtful as we build the charging infrastructure. How much of it do we need to do just to create a reality and a market presence, and then how do we scale it? And I think procurements to create a range of business models for the charging infrastructure is a really smart thing to be doing right now to get us to 30% where we can begin to have more requirements for EV charging. It could be the state. In some cases, utilities are being asked to procure it. So there's different ways you could go about it, but large-scale procurements. Right. If you're a big city like New York City, you could do it.
So the state of Colorado did a procurement for EV charging along certain corridors, and there were bids that were received, and they used some of their VW funds and some of their CMAQ DOT funds, the congestion mitigation, air quality funds, as well to support that.
And you give points for certain types of attributes that are important to meet the needs. So I think I would say that Massachusetts just tried to sort of figure out how do they do PV rooftop, or just, I should say solar electricity on scale. And they've been doing procurements at the state level. And they've been adding different types of points for types of locations. So for brownfields versus greenfields, and areas with congestion versus areas that don't have it. It's been very smart, and they've been getting really good proposals and responses at a lower cost. But they couldn't have done it if there hadn't been incentives just to build a competitive market in the first place to have solar systems. And now they're doing procurements to get them at scale where they want them with the value they want.
We are past our allotted time, but this has been a great question round. I'm going to now it gets to me, my job to sum up what has been a very detailed, dense, but thought-provoking discussion. I'm going to go back to David's slides and thinking about 13 years from horses to cars, and I think, and I'm going to pick up on something that Sue had said, that we talked about deeply personal decisions on whether or not to change your vehicle, to buy a new house, to upgrade your house. I think hopefully we've begun to talk about the pathway to get from horses to cars. That you can see how individual decisions are affected, but also creating the infrastructure in place that supports that and the policies that allow for technologies to scale up and gain market share and gain some of the advantages of competition that exists. So I've learned an awful lot. So what we're going to, and I hope that everyone else learned an awful lot. It's been great. Again, the slides will be made available on our website. We're going to compile some of the additional resources and things that we've heard about today from the panel and make a true resource page where you can go and find a single stop to talk about some of the transportation climate initiative that Jordan mentioned, things that are happening in Norway. I know that there's a lot of resources out there. we'll put all that together. So our next step is we're going to have lunch. For those of you who are new to Vermont Law School, if you need to use the bathroom, through the doors, up the stairs, and then it'd be just past the staircase, it's to your left. If those are occupied, there's ones right above it on the second floor. And then we'll come back, we'll have lunch, and then we will have what will no doubt will be an inspiring talk from Rich Coward.
Thank you, Karen. This was fun. Nice to do this. Yeah.
Yeah, so we'll begin in 12:25 for the talk.